All right. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining today. We might have a few more late additions, but that's no problem at all. Let's see. If folks could mute themselves when they're not talking, that would be great. Much appreciated. And yeah, so my name is Josh Muse. I'm the consultant for library technology here at the Department of Libraries. In addition, I work on the Public Library Annual Report, which might also be known as the Public Library Survey, especially in other states. So thanks everybody for joining in for that. And we're just going to sort of hop through a presentation on it. We'll stop for questions and spots, but we're a relatively small group, so you can also just shout out questions when you like. And for a question, you can just unmute yourself and say it, or you can put your hand up if you know how to do that. Either way is fine. Thanks again for joining. So the annual report. What is the annual report? For those who haven't worked with it very much before, it's basically a kind of statistical overview of the entire almost everything that a library does in a year. There are questions that cover all aspects of library life: number of patrons, circulation, programming, all the financial pieces, etc. So it doesn't capture everything, but it captures most everything. And it covers 1 year. So most of the questions are let's see. Sorry, 1 second. Most of the questions are determined by IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They're sort of the overarching federal agency that handles libraries and museums. It's their survey in a sense, and so most of the questions are written by them with input from each state library. However, some of the questions on the survey are specifically added by us, the Vermont Department of Libraries. Those also change over time. The federal questions can change and the state questions can change as well. So who uses the info in the report after it's done? A lot of people, basically. At the federal level, IMLS, the federal government as a whole, and then other state and public libraries throughout the country will use it to kind of compare themselves with other similar libraries. In the state, it's Department of Libraries uses it heavily, but state government also uses it to sort of see the state of libraries in the state. And then at a local level, your library can use the data, can also use the data, compare yourself to other libraries in the state. And that's the thing I'm always happy to help. If you have questions about how to use the data afterwards, I'm always happy to help with those. And then members of the public. The ultimate data is available to the public, and they can sort of ask questions, see what's there, and see if there's things that they want to know more about. All right. Okay, so big question is, when is the report due? So the submission window can vary from year to year. For example, last year we were pretty late. It happened in, I think the final extension was in March. This year is a lot closer to what we like the timing to be. So we started a bit early on October 16th, but we're aiming for November to December period. And then we had a 2-week extension, but because I messed up the date on it, we made it a 3-week extension, roughly. So January 19th is if you want the optional extension, and to get the extension, you just ask me, and it's all yours. It's basically a way to move people through the process. But the report is due every year. Sorry, I didn't say that. It is an annual report. There are other ones out there that are not annual, but this is due every year. Okay, so this is what time period are you reporting for your library? This is one of the most confusing pieces of the report, because individual libraries have a whole bunch of, in Vermont, have a bunch of different fiscal years. They are, in some cases, a lot of libraries are either the calendar year, which is January through December, or the sort of traditional fiscal year, which is July 1 of one year to June 30 of the next year. But there are a number of libraries who have other dates as well. It's for the most part, we want libraries to use whatever their internal fiscal year is, so you don't have to. So it's the stats you're already collecting and the numbers you're already collecting. However, that can get a little bit complicated. So well, I'll explain the complicated part in a second. It's predominantly complicated if you are a calendar year library, January through December. But so how do you know what period you're supposed to do? Well, one, I sent everybody an email, and the email should tell you what your period is, the time period is that you're reporting on. However, the two rules are whatever you did last year, do the next 12 months. That is the default approach. So that's sort of a good starting point. In general, that means what you should be doing is libraries that follow the July through June schedule, or some of the other federal schedule, which is October through September of the next year, you should submit the current year, the most recent year. So for the July to June libraries, it is July of last year to June of 2023. However, if you are a calendar year library, January through December, you should generally be submitting last year's data, 2022. The only thing to make that slightly intuitive is this current year isn't done yet, so it would be difficult to submit this year's data. This is just because of the way that we have to do the timing. And so I know it's a bit unintuitive to be reporting on last year's data. It introduces some challenges, but it is effectively someone is going to be fairly behind, and that's the way that we've been doing this since we started in the 80s. However, there is an exception. If you already submitted, if you're a calendar year library and you submitted last year's 2022 last year, you're what I call off schedule, in which case you should probably we can talk about it. You have two options. You can keep being off schedule, or you can take a year off and get on schedule. But the most important piece is if you have any questions about the time period you were reporting, you should ask me before you do anything else. Because if you figure out that you're reporting on a different year than we want, and you're like a month and a half into this process, it's not fun. So before you do any work, we want to make sure that we are both crystal clear on what time period you are reporting on. That's the real important piece, is if you have any doubts at all, ask me and we will figure it out. It all works out. It's not, that won't end up being a big deal, but it's just a thing that is not intuitive. So that's time periods. Let's see. Okay. What did we update from last year for everybody who filled out the report last year? Okay, things that we changed. There are relatively few changes from last year. Last year had a ton of changes, but this year the changes are very small, relatively speaking. So first off, and mostly simplification, so that's at least nice. First off, the weeks open and hours open questions for each library, we simplified them. There were categories for COVID and being closed for COVID, having limited access to COVID, and whether you were offering appointments. Those are all just gone. It's just a question of how many weeks were you open and how many hours were you open. We'll talk more about what that means when we're in that section. But the main point on weeks and actually I'm going to say it right now because it's near the beginning. And weeks and hours are you don't need to like subtract to every single hour. If you were closed for 2 hours for something, that doesn't matter. They're just looking for how many hours were you rough ballpark open during the year, and take out closures, basically. That's all that they're interested in. If there are periods that you were closed, take those out. Otherwise, figure out how many weeks you're open, how many hours you're open a week, multiply, boom, that's your number. It only matters if you were closed more than 50% of a week. In general, but I'm happy to talk about that a little further. Next, facilities. Last year, we added a bunch of facilities questions because we did not really have a lot of data on that. The facilities questions used to be, what is your square footage, and nothing else. But particularly with the capital grants coming online, we wanted to ask people more questions, things about meeting rooms, how your building is working for you, basically. So these questions will look the same as last year. The one positive is that they will auto-populate with what you had last year if you filled out the report last year. So if it's the same, you can just leave it. But if something has changed, obviously you can correct that. Next, revenue. Revenue is mostly the same. The only difference is we have a series of in-kind questions at the end, which ask, did you get in-kind support from a town or from another organization? for each of these things, for your building, for landscaping, for collections, etc. And those will also auto-populate whatever you said last year. So if whatever you said last year is still right, then you won't need to do anything there. And if it's changed, you can just change it. You don't need to talk to me about it. Okay, next, services. We used to have a specific question where we're asking about curbside circulation. We're not asking that anymore. Though a lot of libraries are still maintaining it post-COVID, we don't feel that we need that number anymore. So that's gone. COVID. The COVID, yes, there is a whole series of COVID yes/no questions. Did you offer X during the pandemic that were created by IMLS? IMLS has stopped asking those, so they're not there anymore. So at least that makes the report just a smidge shorter than it was before. And then this was from last year, but we don't want you to enter a -1, sorry, if there's a question that you don't have the data for. Previously, that's what we were doing, but we are shifted to wanting you to enter N/A for not available. This is mostly in there because -1s can be a problem with the math, because if you have multiple -1s, it makes a -3, and the system doesn't know what a -3 is. So anyway, in general, we want you to put NA whenever you don't have, the data isn't available, or it didn't get recorded, anything else like that. Okay, I think I'm going to keep plowing ahead till we get to a good stopping point, and then we'll open it up for questions, because in some cases you might have questions that we're just going to cover.
Got it.
So let's see. Okay, so this one is important. We changed the way that the questions look last year, which was we changed the language to match the federal language. But in many cases, it's not visible unless you click a little question mark icon that is next to the question. You'll see a relatively short definition or just the name. I would recommend that if you see a little question mark on a question, that you probably open it up every single time as you go through until it's old hat. Even particularly with even with old staff, I would still do it. I mean, people have been doing it for years because the language has changed a little bit. In general, they're still asking the same things, but so there's going to be this little icon next to each question. I would just click it, little box will open up, it'll say the federal explanation, and then if there's any additional state guidance, we will explain that as well. So yeah, in general, that'll give you some more context to how to answer these questions. Okay, so this one is new. So our goal is, over the next 2 years, and we know that people are, in some cases, are a year behind because of the way fiscal years work. So that's why we're giving a few years. We're trying to move away from estimates that are not based on sample data, where a library, for example, would just say, I think we probably have 4,000 patrons, or that we have 2,000 circs in a year, or something in that vein, that is not, where there's no real evidence behind it. That's just a gut feeling. We want to move away from gut feelings. We want to move towards, obviously, if you can get a real count, that's great, but real counts can be a lot of work for a lot of questions. So what we want people to do instead is to do a sample size. Basically, just pick a couple weeks here and a couple weeks there, measure whatever it is that you don't normally capture all the time, and then multiply it to get an annual number. And you could figure out everything that you don't normally capture and do it all in 2 weeks in May and 2 weeks in October or whenever. And then you're done. You don't need to capture it. Reference questions are a thing that a lot of libraries don't have, I think, good data for. We can talk about, again, if you have individual questions about how to work a sample survey, I'm happy to answer those. But in general, we are trying to move in that direction. Obviously, for your internal use, you can continue to use whatever estimates you want. In the report, we would prefer that people don't use estimates that they think are ballpark, that they just have a sense for. However, but if you don't have a data for it, we want you to just say NA. We would rather have no data for a question than an estimate that has been kicking around for 5 years or something like that. So in general, that is that's the direction we're going in. You don't have to do that this year. We just want to move in that direction so that everybody is sort of working with data that they are actually developing. All right, I think We're about a third of the way through, so I think I'm going to take a little pause. Does anybody have questions on anything that I have mentioned so far? And you can ask questions either by unmuting yourself, which is going to be in the upper right-hand corner. There's a little microphone, or you can put your hand up. There should be an option for raising your hand also in the upper generalish right corner, or in the chat. If you'd rather in the chat, that's fine too. And this is sort of anything that we've covered so far. And we'll definitely have questions later covering the entire thing, but I just want to give folks a chance because I've been going pretty speedily. Okay, so I think we will keep moving, but again, feel free to throw stuff, and you could just, like I said, throw stuff in the chat at any point if that is helpful. Okay, so basics of the report. How do I fill out the report? First off, if everybody should have gotten emailed login information, which is the same as last year and the year before and the year before. It never changes. So you should have gotten that. If you didn't see that, reach out, or you otherwise you don't have it, just reach out to me and we can make sure that you have the right info to get in. Once you're in this survey, so the survey is an online survey. It's a Baker and Taylor manages our survey. But it's an online, just looks like sort of every other web survey, except it's very long, very long. I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's an extensive survey, so it's quite long. But it otherwise looks like every other online survey that you've seen. Things to know about the survey while you're working on it. You can work on the report in any order. It's got A, B, C, D, and it goes in sections, but you don't need to stick to the sections. You can jump around. It's totally fine. You can work on it and then put it aside and work on it again the next day. You don't need to do it in one crazy, wild, unfortunate sitting. You can do it as time goes along. The one thing I would recommend is clicking save on the last page that you're on. If you ever move forward or back, it will save automatically. But if you have a page that maybe you haven't moved forward and back, it never hurts to hit save before you get out. In the upper right-hand corner of the interface is a little button that says show last year's answers. I recommend having that on at all times. It's just a good thing to sort of ballpark what you're doing. So it will show you underneath the question, it'll show you what you entered last year. And that way, you'll see kind of what format the answers look like. And if you will see, oh, this number this year is 10 times what it was last year, which maybe is true, in which case you would probably know it. Or maybe it means that you were looking at it, you're counting it differently, something weird happened. So if you ever get points like that, where you're like, I think either last year is wrong or this year is wrong, talk to me and we will figure out how to proceed. That happens sometimes, frankly. But anyway, it should default. Once you do it, it should stay there. I recommend having it on at all times. It is always helpful. Okay, so I've sort of said this already, but one of the most important things is if you have questions, you should ask me. You should not be like, well, I'll just work on it and figure it out. I'll spend 3 hours on it and I can probably make it work. Don't do that. You don't have time for that. This is a big undertaking, and we are incredibly appreciative that librarians spend time on this. And I don't want you to spend any more time than you have to. So if you get stuck on a thing, just ask me. Email me or call me or whatever, and we'll figure it out. I don't want anybody to feel like it is your job to try to have to wrestle through this. There is wrestling that will happen, but dealing with all the data, but you don't have to. You're not alone. Just come get in touch with me. I will answer it as fast as I can. So that is, I think, one of the most important pieces. I just want to emphasize it. Anytime, get in touch anytime. Okay, so important notes to keep in mind while you are filling out the survey. This is the sort of nitty-gritty stuff. 1, you only want one person in the survey at a time. If you and your assistant director or someone else or a trustee is working on it, you don't want to be in at the same time. You don't even want to have it open in 2 tabs at one time, because every time that you move a page, it will save it, and it is easy to overwrite your data with something else. So I recommend that. That even happens if I am in your survey and you are in your survey at the same time. We can overwrite data, and it's sad. It is not ideal. So in general, just have one thing open, and that's what you want to do. This is one that I'm actually not sure that I said in this report or in this PowerPoint. But another important thing is I recommend when you have numbers, you've gotten numbers, have them written down somewhere. make sure they are somewhere safe. That is somewhere, because frequently what will happen is someone will get a number, they'll put it in the survey, and then if something goes awry, or they like I said, page gets blanked out because 2 people are in it, then you don't have the number anymore. So you want it stored somewhere else, just so you definitely 100% have it. Piece of paper, Excel file, Word, whatever it is. Just make sure that the only copy of a number should not be in the survey. You want it in 2 places, just like backups in general. Okay, browser buttons. So the back and forward in your browser, you generally want to avoid using that while you're in the survey. It will often not break anything, but it's not how it's made to work. And it doesn't, the main thing that it does is if you move back and forward, it doesn't automatically save the page that you're on. What you want to do is use the previous and next buttons that you'll see that are on the page, or the left side navigation, which gives you all the pages in the entire survey. Whenever you move through those, it will automatically save whatever you're working on. So, so you want to do that. You don't want to say forward next. Again, it won't destroy anything, but you may lose data, and that's not great. What browsers should you use? So if you have Google Chrome or recent versions of Microsoft Edge, since they changed to using Google Chrome, that seems to work best. That's what I use. If you have Firefox, it should work, but you could have a little bit of quirks in it. So if that's your best option, it will probably work okay, but I would recommend starting with Chrome or Edge if you have that. My old versions of Microsoft Edge, which at this point would be fairly old, a couple of years old, do not use those. Those make problems happen. We have had some trouble with Safari if you are on Mac. It's sort of like Firefox, but maybe a little more quirks. So it would not be my first choice, but if that is the only browser you have available, then you can give it a try and see what your experience is. Okay, that is important notes. Next. Okay, so I'm going to give everybody another pause because we're about to launch through the different parts of the report. So does anybody have questions on the last few things that I just brought up? And again, you can either unmute yourself, put it in the chat, or raise your hand. And we will still also have questions at the end. But if anybody has ones now that they want to do, please feel free. And it's been a little while since I thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for doing the report. I will thank you even more at the end of it, but I really appreciate it. And really anything that we can do to make this a little less onerous on you, I'm happy to do. So if you ever have ideas for ways to make it less onerous that we can do, just let me know and we can try. Okay, so we're going to plow ahead. So parts of the report. Here you see all the major sections. Some of the sections only have 1 page. Many of them have 2 or 3 pages that you will fill out in the survey. But we're just going to jump ahead to them because I think that's going to be more straightforward. Okay, the first page is directory info. It includes contact information for the library, your address, your phone number, things like that. That all is automatically pre-filled from whatever was last year. If it's wrong, you can't change it. You need to tell me that it's wrong, and sometimes it is. We have something that was wrong for a while, or you may change buildings, or you had a E911 address change. Whatever that is, if there's anything in like the first directory info, you just need to email me and I can change it. After that, it asks for your current librarian and chair of trustees, and for your email. The email is just there, so if we have questions about the report, we have somebody to ask. Then it asks weeks open per year and hours open per year. So this is one we talked about a little bit earlier. Weeks open per year is the only weeks that don't count are weeks that you were closed more than half the time. And it doesn't talk about, we're not looking at holidays, we're only looking at closed. So usually if you closed for disaster or construction or something else like that. Or if you're a part of your library, if you're a library who closes for either part of winter or part of summer. Otherwise, 52 is the answer for everybody, if none of those are relevant. Hours open per year. These are basically, it's kind of the ballpark number. You take, how many hours am I open a week? Okay, 20. How many weeks am I open? 52. Multiply them by each other. You don't need to take out each holiday or anything else like that. You only need to take out significant closures. So again, disasters, construction, things like that. So these should be this is how we did it like 3-4 years ago before COVID. It was just weeks and hours, but it should be relatively straightforward. Next, it asks you about your population, but you can't fill that out. We fill that out. The numbers you'll see right now are actually last year's numbers because they haven't census hasn't released the New Year's data that we use. So, but that's fine. They'll be there. I will update them before it's done. If you have questions about how population works, or if you think we're figuring it out wrong, which is talk to me and we can figure it out. Talk about it, because it is a little bit esoteric where the population figures come from. But we do have a page on our website talking you through that. Anyway, so you don't have to touch that. Next, it asks you a reporting period, which is basically beginning to end of the year. Again, the default is it should be the year after whatever you reported last year. And in general, depending on what kind of fiscal year you have, it is either last year, it's either the most recent period, or if you're a calendar library, you're going to be reporting 2022 normally. Again, if any questions on reporting periods, you just ask me. Okay. Staffing, second section. This is, okay, sorry, I need to emphasize this because it looks a little confusing. Let me rephrase. The questions are written in a confusing fashion because we're using the federal language, and the federal language asks something slightly different than what we're really asking. So what you're entering is how many weekly hours for all of these categories of employees that you have in your library, paid employees. A librarian who has an MLS, a librarian who has a public library certificate, a librarian who does not have an MLS. And then those get totaled for librarians. And then all other staff, anybody else who is in the library budget. Then there is additionally a question if there's anybody who is outside the library budget. This is often AmeriCorps or some other kind of esoteric positions, but you may have a staff member who is just paid from another bucket that is totally different from the library. And then there's a question about volunteers. And this is average volunteer hours in a week. So all of these questions, though the label is confusing, what we want to know is weekly hours for each of these people, not number of people, weekly hours for these people. The disparity is because IMLS asks for full-time equivalent, FTE, and I think I don't want to do that in Vermont because that seems like a lot of math because so many people are not full-time. So we ask for a number of hours, but that's why it looks like maybe you should be entering the number of librarians. It is not ideal. So what you want to do there's a good question. I'm going to come back to that in one sec. Thank you. Yes, so you want to make sure you're doing number of hours, not number of people. However, there is one question at the very end that we added last year because we never had an idea how many people are on staff. And the question is total number of staff, permanent staff. This is full-time, part-time. It is only subs if the subs come basically every week. A given sub. If you use subs in a sort of more traditional model, we don't need their number. Okay, so that was a great question, which was, and there's a little rabbit hole that I'm going to take you down right now. What about non-librarians with an MLS? So the short answer is they go under all other staff. All other staff doesn't care what degree they have. What all other staff is anybody. So that's the short answer. The slightly longer answer is that the definition of what's a librarian or not a librarian is a little bit internally dictated to some degree. It's a librarian has this sort of complicated definition of whether, in general, people who have been filling out the survey for a long time, I recommend just doing what you're doing. But if you have questions about who's a librarian, who's not a librarian, you can always ask me. Again, it's sort of, unfortunately, IMLS's definition is a little bit short, is not very strict about who falls where. And so I think there is actually some variation in how libraries report it. I'm totally comfortable with libraries using whatever their internal definition of who's a librarian, who's not a librarian. It doesn't, if you have a title librarian, that's a good sign, but in some cases, it might be more complicated than that. It could be more complicated than that, but ultimately libraries can decide this. There was one more question, which is, we have a person that cleans 10 hours per week. Is this position counted in all other staff? So the question is, it gets a little bit vague. If they are not vague, a little more complicated. If you work, if it's sort of they're like a vendor, you pay the firm, somebody comes and does it, and you're just paying a vendor, then they are not an employee for this context. But if they get paid like every other staff member out of the budget, they get a paycheck from you or the town, and then they are a staff member at that point. So that is sort of the dividing line. Even if you have regular cleaners that come all the time, but you pay a firm, the firm pays them, they're not really your employee. There's a couple of levels removed. So that would be my take on that, but please chime in if that didn't answer your question on that. So that's staffing. We are going to hop forward to facilities. So this question is the one that used to be very short. It was, what's the square footage of your building? And we didn't ask anything else. That's the only federal question. We added a bunch of new questions. And like I said, the one positive is they carry over from last year. So if you filled out last year, whatever you had last year should be there. If you need to fix anything, just change it. It's not locked down. You can change it at will. But if everything's still the same, then you're fine. So we asked things like square footage. And again, this carries over from last year as well. And generally, it doesn't change unless two things. You had an addition, you moved to another building, three things, or it was always wrong. And sometimes they were always wrong. We've had a few of those. So if you think that square footage is wrong, let me know. That one I think cannot change. You might need to reach out to me on that. The other questions are a lot more nuanced. For example, what year was the library built? What year was it last expanded, if it was? And what year was it sort of refreshed? Carpet painting, things like that, if there was one. And again, use your best remembrance of this. And then, and maybe the most important questions, how well does the building size and condition, these are two separate questions, meet your needs? It's sort of it's a sliding scale from poor to excellent. And depending on where your situation is at, you might be at any of them. And then there's a text box to explain a little bit about that. Then we also ask about meeting rooms, how big they are, if people are available, if people can rent the space. And then also, who owns the building, specifically if the library doesn't own the building. If it belongs to another organization, then that can get pretty convoluted. But if you have questions about that, reach out. Sometimes there are weird situations in that front. So we're just trying to get a better handle on that. That is all the facilities questions, or that's a summary of them. Okay, so now we're into finances. And these finance questions, if you haven't done them before, you are kind of putting them together yourself. Additionally, if you have a treasurer on the board of trustees, they are helpful. And if you're a municipality, you're going to talk to the town. And see if you can get these numbers. These can be really straightforward, or it can require a little bit of wheedling, for example, particularly the town situation. But what are we asking? We are trying to get almost all of your income. There's a few little weird exceptions, but basically almost all your income is going in here. The first, and in many cases largest, is local tax support. So we want you to fill out every town or village or other municipality, though there aren't a lot of people who get that you get money from. So you want to list the town or village and the amount you get. And there's a little spot to add another one, so you can add as many of these as you want. Next, grants. There are three sections of grants: state, federal, and other. So it's not immediately clear. The stuff that, for example, you get from us, it's not immediately clear which one of those you want to use. So what you want to do is, this is a good spot to hit the question mark. That gives you more information. It will list the whole thing. And for example, it will tell you that summer program grants are state, because that's the funding source they come from. Whereas courier grants are federal, because they come from our LSTA money. If you ever have questions about where things go, reach out and I'm happy to answer it. But in general, it will get you started about which category things go in. I think I will mention, because I'll forget it later, is when we get to expenses, where you spend your money, we used to have a separate expenses for grants. We wanted to know how much money was being spent on grant projects. And we have removed that. We just want you to fold that into whatever part it's going into. There's not a separate, so that is not income, but expenses. When you were saying, I had a grant project, but it was just books, that just goes into collections. It doesn't need to get broken out anymore. Okay. Other things that count in operating income, non-resident fees. This is if you charge people to get a card who are non-residents. Basically, there's the first question of how much do you charge, and then what's the total amount that you made from that. Next, there is a late fees question. The two actually. The first one is, do you charge late fees? Yes or no? And then, how much money did you make from late fees? Again, like everything in the report, if it turns out that's a number you just don't have, you know that you did charge something, but you don't know what they are, that is where you want to put an NA for not available, and that's totally fine. Don't feel bad about that at all. Okay, so that's late fees. Next, fundraising, donations, and interest basically all go under other income. So that is everything that gets into the library. It's fairly, so what we want is, and I'm just going to repeat these again, fundraising from this year, donations from this year, interest from an endowment or a savings account or anything like that. The thing that you do not count here, and this is a change from last year, is we used to ask you, there used to be a category called transfer. And this was, for example, if you were taking money from previous years out of an endowment or a savings account. We used to ask for that. I think that we tracked it because we just wanted to know what people were doing. But it made our numbers weird on a national level. So we don't ask that anymore because in theory, it's from a previous year. The income should have happened in a previous year, and we don't want it to be counted. So I know that can get a little complicated fast. So I'm happy to explain that if you run into a particular situation. But the short version is all the money that came in this year include. Any money that came in a previous year and was sitting around, don't include, because that already should have been counted. Then in-kind support. There's this whole matrix, and this is yes, no. We're not asking for how much. We just want yes or no. There are two categories: municipal. So if your town or village, it provides some level of support in these ways, and then everybody else. So if you're some other organization, you share a building, somebody else is providing this. And these are yes, no. They are, do I get help with the building? That doesn't show up in the budget? Do I get help with landscaping? That doesn't show up in the budget. Do I get help with collections, computers, marketing? So they're just yes, no's. One positive is these will carry over from last year. So if they're the same as last year, you don't have to do anything. And in general, some people ask, well, how about if we pay for 2/3 of it and they pay for like 1/3 of it? What do you want to do? It's basically, if they have a kind of a significant contribution, then you should say yes. If it's a negligible amount, then you don't need to include it. But if it's any considerable level of support, even if it's 20% or something like that, it still counts as a yes here. Okay, so that's operating income, the first of the finances. All right, capital revenue. This is a fairly short one and only applies to some folks in a given year. This is revenue for major capital projects. Major capital project is often building related or other very large project related. Money that is put aside for this one project. It's not for sort of attrition. It's not like, oh, we had to buy 2 chairs. That is not capital. We had to replace all of our furniture, would be capital. We built an addition. That is money for capital. Potentially an ILS, something like that, could be capital. It's basically a major one-time expense. It's not a thing that would happen regularly. So if you can break those out, put them in here. This is, again, income. There's a separate question about expenses. But yeah, let's see. Do we have? Okay, good. I thought I had a chat question that I missed, but I think I'm caught up. Okay, so that's capital revenue. This one, for many libraries, is very short because it's often 0. Okay, next, operating expenditures, second half of the fiscal piece. This is a little bit more involved than the income, I will say. So how did you spend your money? This, again, we're trying to capture almost every spot that you spend money. So first off, collections. It asks how you spend money on collections. It asks you to break down 3 categories. This is sort of one of the first of the kinds of questions where we ask you to break something down by category. So in this case, it's what was spent on print, what was spent on electronic resources, basically online, and what was spent on other. Other is things like DVDs, playaways, and library things. So this is the first of a kind of thing where we ask you for, can you break down into these three categories? However, if you can't break it down, but you still have a total number, there's a spot to put the total in. That's totally fine. Don't worry about it. If you just have a total but can't break it down, there's going to be a lot of these as we go on through the rest of the survey. So that's again, don't give us the data you have. So there's another one. The next question is staff. How much money is spent on staff? It asks you to explain salaries and benefits, or if you can't break it down, a total. The one thing I will say here is that benefits, if you pay people, benefits can't be zero because this includes Social Security, and that's other mandatory expenses. So if you can't find it, so that should, yes, benefits should never be zero if you have any staff expenses. You can say you don't know the answer, and that's totally fine if you can't get a hold of it from town or wherever else, but it shouldn't be zero. If it is zero, I'll either reach out or I will just make it a total and fix that there. Other expenses, programming. This is one we started asking last year. Programming is how much money, if you could tell, how much money did you spend on programming? It breaks it out by age group. It is adults, teens, or YA, and children. Again, if you have the answer, you can break it out by age. If you don't have the answer, you can put in a total. If you don't know your programming numbers at all, there's a spot later that you can just put a total in. Other expenses that you'll be talking about. Building operations, if you happen to know what that figure is, that is money that is in the library budget that you are spending. These are all money that is in the library budget. So if the town deals with your building and you never see any of this, you have no building expenses because you don't know what they are. They are not in your budget. We can talk about that if you have questions down the line. So building operations, technology, which is anything computery that has not already been included in one of the categories, and then other, which is truly anything else. But there is an option if you can't break out programming and other expenses, there's a spot to put totals in. And then last but not least, capital expenditures. If you, we talked about capital revenue, but if you have stuff in expenditures that you spent this year, that's the important piece that you spent this year, it will go under capital expenditures. I'm going to take a little stop here because we're a good chunk through the report. Any questions on the parts of the report that we have looked at already? And again, same old, you can put your hand up, you can put it in the chat, you can unmute yourselves. Okay, we'll keep going forward. Again, opportunities will keep going for questions. Holdings. This is how many blanks are in your collection of a bunch of different categories, and then what age range is. So this is a number that you are likely getting from your ILS if you have an ILS. How many print materials do you have? And then it breaks it out by, let's see, it breaks it out. Thank you. I'll get to that ARPA question in one sec. It breaks it out by age. So print materials, adults, YA, kids, video materials in the three categories, audio in the three categories, downloadable ebooks, downloadable audiobooks in the categories. If you have, and this is the number that you have, number of items that you currently have. If you can't break it down by category, put in the total, totally fine. Downloadable ebooks and audiobooks. Then we ask about print magazines and newspapers. There's less of that in use at this point, but most libraries still have some, I think. Non-traditional items. These are library of things items. Everything. Muffin pans, skis, hair dryer, tools, a robotics kit. Any of the stuff that's in that vein that is sort of not, I guess, non-traditional items, we'll say, go in there. Count by if you put some, if something's sort of a package deal, just count one for it. Like you don't count, well, we have 2 skis and 2 ski poles. That's all one thing. Whatever it is, if it's a thing that you hand out as a piece, it should go there. Online databases. So there's two questions here. There's one which is state-provided ones, and that's already filled in, so you don't need to do anything there. And then the other one is library ones. So if there's other databases that you pay for, Ancestry or Consumer Reports or Mango, anything like that, you don't. All the number you need here is one database. So that's that. So there was a question about ARPA funding. So ARPA funds, when they come in, would go under federal grants because they're ultimately federal funded. So on the way in, the year they come in, they would want to be under that. For spending them, you should just put them in whatever category they would normally be. So if the expense is a collections-based expense, put it under collections. If it's under programming, put it under programming. So we don't break them. We don't break them out. So you don't need to put grant expenses in a little category. You just put them wherever they would normally belong. So thank you. Let's see. All right, so that was holdings. All right, we're home stretch. Unfortunately, services is the longest category by far. Services is everything else. So what does services ask? Again, everything that we haven't asked yet is in services because of the way services has sort of gotten bigger as time has gone along. But what are we going to ask there? Number of registered borrowers, broken down by adult and children if you can, or totals if you can't. Number of visits. This is, I mean, however you track visits, that's the number we want. In general, for example, if you have a door counter, we just want the door count. But if you track it by hand, we want that number. However you have it tracked, that's great. If you do not always track this is the thing that would be good to do a sample period. Just pick 2 weeks somewhere that is not your busiest and not your most least busy, and get that, and then multiply by number of weeks, and that'll give you an annual number. Reference questions. This is every time anybody asks you a reference question. The definition of a reference question is very broad. So anything that is not purely directional is probably going to end up being a reference question. Again, we know that it's something that is hard to track because it's hard to run a library and answer all the questions and write down that you've answered all the questions. So it's another thing that might go good as a sample period if you were not tracking it normally. This is a thing that I think somewhere in the next couple of years we're kind of double down on trying to get reference, because I think that's a thing that is important that libraries do that we're not all able to capture very well. Okay, downloadable item circulation. This is something that you're going to be having to go to if you have Overdrive, going to the Overdrive marketplace. If you have Palace, I can help you with it. If you have something else, Hoopla, Canopy, you will go to their thing and get stats for the year. I'm happy to help as far as I can. I'm totally I'm familiar with. I can't help you get into Overdrive, but I'm familiar with Overdrive, so we can talk through that. So again, we're trying to capture that. So it's broken into ebooks and audiobooks. It's broken into age, and then there's another category which is other stuff, which is if you offer magazines, comics, music, movies, things like that. That'll go in the other category, just lumped together. Next, physical item circulation. This is just normal physical items. We want them broken down by age if you have it, and just give us a total if you don't have it. Curbside pickup. Oh, sorry, that shouldn't be there anymore. We don't ask that question anymore. So that one's gone. Non-traditional circulation, that is still in there. So the one trick with non-traditional is you want to put that number in your physical item circulation as well. So non-traditional circ is just a number total for the non-traditional circ, but it also appears in physical item circ. This is one case where you're not double counting. They just want it in 2 places. That's the way they've set it up. So if your muffin tin goes out, it would be check in both places. ILLs loaned and received. This is a number that you can get through Clover to some degree. So we just want to know how many you sent and how many you got. If you are on Catamount or another system that offers consortial lending, ideally we want that number too, because that is sort of ILL by another name. So if you can capture that and you do it, that's great. If you can't, we understand. Programs and attendance. This section is enormous. I apologize. It is the federally structured, and this is very long. So programs and attendance. Each of those are broken into 3 locations and 5 age groups. I will say, again, there is an option for totals. If you can't break it out, it's totally fine. I understand. It is long and very granular, more granular than if I had my druthers than we would have. So the 3 locations are in the building, offsite, and virtual. At this point, I think we've shifted back so that on-site is the lion's share for most people, but we still want to know if you have programs off-site. Off-site is off your property, not outside. If you're at somewhere else, if you're at the school or a childcare center or at an event, something like that, that's off-site. And then virtual is you're on Zoom or Google Meet or something like that, and you are doing virtual programming. Virtual programming is still happening, though is certainly diminished after the pandemic has in the current state of the pandemic, I'll say. All right, so that was programs and attendance. Again, it is long and involved. Give us what you have. If you only have totals, that is 100% fine. I'm never going to say, I'm probably never going to say, we really need the subcategories, because I know that this question is long. Okay, next, outreach. Outreach is deliveries to childcare centers, like senior centers, or if you do book deliveries to individual patrons. It's just number of deliveries, not number of items. So that's that. Wi-Fi usage. Wi-Fi usage, what we're trying to track is number of sessions. This one is, depending on how your Wi-Fi is set up, is probably either somewhat easy, pretty hard, or virtually impossible, unfortunately. It's a question that at the federal level, we've had a lot of trouble getting good data for. So give us the data that you have. Again, I would rather, in the next 2 years, I would rather move away from, I think it's probably about 1,000. I would rather not have any number there, frankly, and I will not begrudge you not having a number there. So last question, visits to your website. This is a question that I will say is departing next year. So if you, this is a question that can be easy to capture or hard or impossible depending on your website product. So if you can get it, great, but do not spend a lot of time on it for reals. Don't. Because again, we're just not going to be tracking it as of next year at the federal level. So that is services. Okay, so I think this is another good stopping point. So people who have questions, please either put them in the chat. There's still a little bit more, but we're kind of in the 7th inning stretch right now. So you can either unmute yourself, put up your hand, or put questions in the chat. And we will still have spots for questions later. So yes, Bree, please unmute yourself if you can.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I might have missed this. I had a little internet outage. But if the library, so for meetings that take place in the library outside of library hours, I know that we count those folks, they use the space. What if we allow groups to use the library's Zoom account for meetings, like the rec department uses? So we're basically creating a virtual meeting space for them. So I know we have 2 town groups that use our Zoom account, which is a service we provide for free, just like our meeting space. Does that get captured anywhere?
That's a great question. Give me 1 second, and I'm gonna. So there is a question, which is what you were sort of referencing. There's a question in programming that asks non-library sponsored events in your library. So in a non-Zoom situation, that would go there. I'm just gonna check very quick and see how that's phrased, because it would make sense to include it there. I'm just trying to see, and it may be that we would have to change the language next time around, but let me just. It looks like right now it sort of defines it as held in library facilities.
Okay.
Well,
maybe next year, because I'm not collecting that data right now anyway, and I was kind of like, oh,
let's imagine that we are going to collect it next, that it can get lumped in next year, I think is what, because the IMLS views a Zoom meeting as a meeting, basically, as a program. So I think that if you're offering somebody else a virtual program, it's the same thing. In fact, I would say if that number becomes available this year, you could enter it this year as well.
Okay.
But we'll aim to, going forward, we'll change the language, but I think that is effectively the similar thing. But thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay. All right. Let's see. Do we have? Okay. Oh, Sue has a great question. If a program is a hybrid in-person / virtual, do we count it as both? So thank you for bringing that up, because that is complicated. Well, not complicated, but a little bit unintuitive. So there are two pieces here, and I apologize that this is how it's structured. First off, hybrid in-person virtual program should only be counted once. The program should only be counted once. I would pick whichever has more attendance, or that's probably my default, or is somehow more important, is more of the core. I would pick that one and put it there. But because of the way IMLS views virtual programs and in-person programs, they're equivalent. So effectively, if it gets counted in both places, it looks like you have two programs. And I understand that that's sort of underselling it. I know that a hybrid program is significantly more work than just one or the other. But I would put it in whichever you feel is most indicative for the program. You definitely want to count attendance at both, and you can put them in both categories if you're able to do that, or you can lump them together if that is more reasonable. But count the program once, count all the attendance for both kinds. Ideally, count them in two different, in person and not in person. But if you can't, that's fine too. There is a separate case, there's a separate question that I glossed over, which was recorded programs. How often, if you had recorded programs, and how many times were people looking at them? Recorded programs are typically, we had a Zoom presentation. We left it on YouTube or something like that, and people could just look at it whenever. But it could also be if you had a recording that is, if you could record it all ahead of time, like we recorded this, there was no audience, and then we put it up on YouTube. That would also be a recording. So the reason I bring up recordings especially is because if you have a virtual event and then you have you put the recorded event on YouTube, that can be counted in both, because a recording is not the same. They don't see as the same level as a program. It's like less, basically. So it's okay that they both are there. I know that is confusing, but basically, if you have a hybrid in-person and virtual program, it should only be counted once. But if you have a virtual program and then you leave the recording on your website or on YouTube, that would count as a recording, and as well as the virtual program. Hopefully that makes sense. It is confusing. Feel free to email or call me if you want me to elaborate, or jump in if that doesn't sound like it made sense. Myrna asks, are most questions that end up in a book search or circulation considered reference questions? Yes, the definition is pretty broad. I think that if somebody asks where the bathroom is, that is not a reference question. If you have to do work really at all, it suddenly becomes a reference question. What is a reference question is a sort of more of an art than a science, but this definition that we're using is very broad. And if you've done any work at all, including looking something up, that is that even if you looked it up earlier in the day and you still know where the Grishams are or something like that, that's still reference. So I would say cast the net wide on reference questions. And then also asked, you might have said this already, can we answer the report in sections? Yes, 100%. You can go in whatever order works, whatever data you have at a given moment. The one thing you want to do is it will not hurt to click the save button, which is going to be in the upper right when you're done with the page, just because if you move around in the survey, it will automatically save it. But if you are on your last page, you make some edits and then you just close it, it's not going to save it unless you click save. But there's no order. You can do it in any order you want. You can come back to things. You can say, oh, we don't have that. There's also an option to flag a question if you have trouble. You're like, I don't have this data right now, or this doesn't make sense. You can flag it. That way you will know that you need to come back to it. Any other questions? Feel free to either raise your hand, unmute, or just throw it in the chat. But I'm going to jump ahead to what is an edit check. An edit check is what you're going to see when you are done filling out the survey, and then you go to submit. You can also just, click status in the menu, and it will tell you what's left. It will tell you if you have edit checks. It will tell you if there are questions that are mandatory that you have not filled out, and it will tell you if there's any flagged questions. Flagged questions are something you do. They don't happen to you. So if you see a flag, that means that you put it in because you weren't sure about something. But an edit check basically means the system thinks that the data in that field looks weird. What it generally means is that it's a lot higher or a lot lower than it was last year. One of the challenges we've been running into through COVID is that was true. The numbers were totally different. And so it gives you an option to give an explanation for it. So the explanation for COVID was pretty straightforward. I had a lot of explanations that were COVID, period, COVID, period. But your answer can be, if you know why it happened, if it makes sense to you, you can say, we did more programming, or we were out, our children's librarian wasn't around, or whatever. It's some explanation. We did outreach, something was successful. If you don't have an answer, then we can think about why that number might be different than it was. If it number is 30 times higher, then we will definitely need some sort of answer, some sort of explanation. But we will figure that out. So if you get to one of those and you're like, I don't have any idea why this number is totally different, reach out to me and we will figure out why. Okay, once you put in your answers, you'll say submit corrections at the bottom. And it will give you a green check mark to say, okay, that's great, you're done with that. It will, or if you see a red X, it means one of two things. It means either there's a spot for federal comments, state comments, and other comments. A red X may mean that it wanted a state comment and you put it in a federal comment, which is easy to do. Red X sometimes means that it's a question that it will not let you go by. It thinks the data is broken some fashion and it won't let you do it. So if you get one of those, talk to me and we will figure it out. Further than that, if you get to the point where you are working on edit checks and it is taking you a while, feel free to just say, Josh, will you just look at these? And I'm happy to do it. They will probably make more sense to me. And then I will reach out and say, oh, okay, yeah, it looks like your circ doubled. Why did your circ double? Or I'll say, oh, no, that's just a weird little thing. And we'll put a comment in and it'll go away. So feel free at any point when you're, even the moment that you hit edit check stage, just be like, I don't want to do it. Josh, do it. And I will come back and we'll get it all through. So that's edit checks. Final steps. So this actually happens, this is out of order. So final steps, edit check is after that. Final steps are, it asks you your name and title, the director and chair of trustees certify. This was more relevant when standards were in play, which they are technically in play, but we don't, there's not a certification that you meet standards anymore. But we still ask everybody to do this. Then there are two box fields, text boxes, that say, what's new at your library? And we love this when we get it. It's as much data as you want, it's as little data as you want, but just what's new. We are happy to have whatever we have. It's always fascinating, and it's stuff that is not quantifiable. So it's great, really interesting data. One thing I will say is we will publish it. So if you don't want to publish, don't put it in there. We're going to release it to people because it's really fascinating stuff. The second one below that is feedback on the report. What I'm really looking for, I think that people have a tendency to try to be nice because it seems like it's grading my performance, and that's not it at all. We're trying to figure out if there's anything we could do to make the report easier. And The answer may be the stuff that is in the way is stuff that we can't change, but I want to know about it. If you have any ideas, if there's different trainings, if there's things that we could offer, if there is anything that we could do to make the report easier, quicker, less trouble on librarians who have no time to fill out a giant report, let me know. And I will never take it personally. I just want to try to make this the best that I can. And that is, then you're done. Then you will get to your edit check phase. This is just quickly what happens after you submit. You will certify it. What we're going to do once we're done with the extension period is we're going to, and maybe even before that, we will submit the draft data that we have and put it out there, because some people have uses for it around town meeting day, before town meeting day, I should say, to try to use it to explain things about to their situation, what they've accomplished, so on. But it's good to be able to compare with other libraries. So we try to get that out as fast as we can. It's draft data at that point. Then I try to, anybody who is like partially done, I try to convince them to be done. Then there's this sort of basically the equivalent of what you all are doing. I do the same thing with IMLS, where I am submitting all the data from 150 libraries, and I have to tweak everything and make sure that it gets all submitted. Ultimately, once IMLS says, okay, great, and we certify the form, and we're done for a year, and then we have to do it again next year. Ultimately, that data gets published. We publish our own data, the statewide data, relatively a few months afterwards. So you can see the 2022 data in a giant spreadsheet on our website. IMLS is a couple of years behind because of the work that they have to do. So you can see the national IMLS data, but again, it's not super quick. And if anybody is interested in looking at that data, they have a what's called the search and compare tool that is a good way to find other libraries that are similar sizes. Again, the issue is it's a couple of years behind, but and okay, so I am going to close this screen share. Oh, sorry. How do I? And of course, I've forgotten how to eliminate this. Phooey. Sorry. Okay. I'm just going to go for a second. I am going to open up the survey itself. This is what the survey looks like. You sort of already got the experience of it, but this is what you'll be looking at. And I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but and now I've gotten rid of the screen share. So other questions that people might have. Feel free to unmute yourself or put your hand up or put something in the chat. I will say that the first couple of times you do the survey, can be fairly intimidating. It is, if nothing else, is quite long. In general, we feel like most of our questions are things that make sense for a library to know. That doesn't mean that everybody knows it, because everybody is very busy all the time, obviously. But most of the questions are things that that sort of make sense for a library to have. But again, that doesn't mean that you always have the data. We want you to give us the best data you have. If you don't have the data, particularly if there's like a transition and the data just doesn't seem to exist, totally fine. We know how it goes. We are here to help however we can. Any other questions? I'll say this is, even though this went an hour and 15 minutes, this is still, I kind of did the lightning version of the survey. So I'm always happy to elaborate in great painstaking, well, as painstaking as you want, detail about every aspect of the report. So when questions come up, or if you just think of a question 10 minutes from now, reach out and we will get you an answer. And again, I wanted to emphasize how appreciative that I and the rest of the department are of every librarian who works on the report. I know that you are all incredibly busy and that this is just a huge, is a big lift to add on everything else that you're doing. We really appreciate it. We are mandated to do it, but we also really think that the data is useful. But that being said, we know that you are extraordinarily busy, and we just, without obviously without every library who is able to submitting, there's no stats. It doesn't exist. I'm just looking at a giant empty spreadsheet. So any other last minute thoughts or questions? Okay, so the two most important things that I would say are, one, make sure you are 100% on what your reporting period is. If you are not, please reach out soon, immediately-ish. And two, and even more important almost, is ask me questions all the time if you have questions. Just don't. The worst situation for me is when I hear, well, okay, I worked on it for 3 hours and I couldn't get it nailed down. I really don't like to hear that, because you don't have 3 hours, realistically. So anything that I can do to help, you should always never hesitate. No question is too small. No question is too silly or obvious or any of those things, because ultimately the report is not easy or intuitive. It is somewhat unintuitive. So thank you so much, Colleen. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate, again, everybody who is willing to do anyone who has ever worked on the report is always in my good list, and gets a star for every moment that they've spent on it. All right. Well, I think, unless anybody has any last minutes, I think I am going to close this up. Give you, get back to the rest of your day, and so on. But again, reach out whenever you have questions. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time today, and I will be talking to you soon. Take care, everyone.